So this is, of course, sparking a lot of debate as it is right now. We know that has been a very ticklish issue. But now they're coming up with a plan to create or creation of a Palestinian state with the capital in Jerusalem. Also Israel settlement in Israel settlement in the West Bank as it is, and I think 4 years, I'll give you the details, 4-year new, I scribbled something here, I can't see clearly. But let's just begin with the creation of a Palestinian state with the capital, Jerusalem, as it is right now. Let's just begin with Hassan Khannenje, please.
First of all, that is not a Middle East peace plan. That is a Middle East war plan.
War plan?
Yeah. I've never seen a mediator in my entire life who announces his mediation strategy with one of the parties and in complete absence, not even by invitation, of the other party. And I'm not surprised that Netanyahu said is willing to go into a peace negotiation with Palestinians on the basis of Trump's peace plan, because it's actually Netanyahu's peace plan. Yeah. That is why the person who spoke the most, it is not the mediator, but actually one of the parties to the conflict in terms of unveiling that plan. So that is dead on arrival.
Yep.
Now, there's another context we need to understand this, though. This, by many analysts, both from whether it's New York Times or the Haaretz, which is the main newspaper in Israel that's liberal, equivalent to the New York Times, they see it as an attempt by both a president who is facing an impeachment trial today and by a prime minister who is facing an indictment, a criminal indictment for corruption, to try and perhaps send a message they're trying to do something, especially in appealing to their constituencies. We know that Netanyahu traveled, not just alone, but his main rival, Benny Gantz, was also held talks with Donald Trump, and it's likely to actually succeed him in case he doesn't survive. And so there's an attempt to try and save their political base. However, what this creates is not a functional Palestinian state. It gave Israel virtually everything they have ever wanted. It gave Palestinians virtually nothing. It cannot be a viable state. It's not a contiguous state. Neither is it even supposed to have a standing military, for its own army. So there's really no state that is going to be formed out of this. So I will not treat this with any seriousness, and don't think any world leader, any student who's been to school at least up to class 2 is actually going to take this seriously. Now, we know that Netanyahu is very clever in manipulating the world. And it's extremely sad because this is coming on the heels of the 75th anniversary of the liberation of one of the worst camps in Auschwitz, in which close to 1 million Jewish people were killed. Now, how that can again turn a victim into an oppressor, I don't understand. It's something that baffles me sometimes. But there's a tendency that people who've been victimized, they tend to victimize others with actually seeing their own crimes. And I think as we move as the world, we need to understand that what has happened in the last several years, and especially the kind of relationship that exists between Trump and Netanyahu, has not been good for the world peace and for the Middle East peace. And it's not even good for those of us who are trying to fight terrorism, because the primary reason and mobilization tool for lots of jihadist organizations has actually been the question of Palestine and the third holiest mosque for Muslims, which is actually based in Jerusalem. That is why, by saying Jerusalem is going to be the undivided capital of Israel, that's just putting a death nail. This internationally has been agreed. It was supposed to be a final status settlement within the United Nations. That is what many countries hold, and they don't recognize what just happened yesterday.
But
can I add something?
Palestinians have refused also to deal with the Trump administration in protest, of course, of what he's doing with the pro-Israel policies as it's moving. Also, the U.S. embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv. So, how would you expect also, the other side of Palestine to be in that particular negotiations if, of course, they've taken a stand as it is right now?
Of course.
Can I add something
just
to
to
that?
finish?
Yeah, just briefly finish, then we go to Hashi.
Palestinians refused to negotiate with Trump because the very first time Trump made any effect in terms of foreign policy was the Middle East. He decidedly took the Israeli side and moved ahead to actually recognize, moved the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem. That makes it increasingly difficult for even Palestinians to actually trust that this is going to be an honest broker. He has been the most dishonest broker in the Middle East peace plan in the U.S. history of any American president who's actually ever been involved in the Middle East peace process. And so you can understand the apprehensiveness and the lack of trust within the American administration. Even Europeans don't trust that Trump can actually do that.
Okay, Hashim.
Well, the only person missing in that group was the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. And I think that he's probably more conservative than those two people put together. I think the Saudi Foreign Ministry tweeted that they supported this document, and probably because the Saudis want to ally themselves with Israel and the United States because of their problem with Iran in the Middle East. And so the Crown Prince there has come up with neoconservatism as his answer to whatever is happening in the Middle East. And I think that that's not going to work. I just think what has been laid bare here is that the United Nations, that great institution that was formed by great minds and great men and women, is missing in action. The United Nations used to be at the center of trying to find solutions to world problems. And we used to have secretary generals that were independent and who had some moral force to go and fight for issues that were part of the vocabularies of what is called the just cause in the world. And today the United Nations cabal is just subservient to the states in the Security Council, and probably something needs to be radically changed about international diplomacy, because once actors from the very right take positions of power and start determining what world peace is going to look like, we're in a lot of trouble. The Middle East is flaring up in a big sense, and it could catch, just like this virus from China, that could catch the world's imagination, cause problems around the world, and that would affect us in Africa as well.
All right,
so I think we've said quite a bit here in terms of it, and there's probably three quick points. I mean, anybody on this panel, I think, could probably school the diplomats, both from Israel and Tel Aviv and Washington, on the principles of peace negotiation. It has all the signs, really, of a botched, effort, and it will not go very far. And I think the context is both its proponents are really suffering domestic credibility questions, and impeachment is not very far from either of those two gentlemen. But the other important point, I think, is the Palestinian Authority have already rejected it. I mean, it was rejected outright, and Jerusalem is not really is not for sale or for this peace plan. I think the second point really is really around. I think Ashi has raised an important point about multilateralism this period, and I think the critical point is is the UN still a viable global force for peace and security? I would ask the same question of the African Union at this point. I think 2 weeks ago I saw what seemed to be like a complaint that the African Union was not being involved in the processes around Libya. And I really, it pained me as somebody who's worked on the African Union and believes in Pan-Africanism and has had the opportunity to work with Ambassador Mwencha and the former President Konare and others. We don't have the global leadership that is required to deal with the complexity of our global problems at the moment. And let's just be clear about it. So we need to look for leadership from somewhere else. And then the last point, I think, is simply just to say that, when Dusit was attacked, one of the things that Al-Shabaab noted in their justification for intimidating and hurting Kenyans was really our foreign policy position that was I guess was revealed when we sent an ambassador to that cocktail party in the opening of the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem. And I think what's important also for our diplomats domestically is to begin to reposition Kenya so that we are conscious of the fact that multilateralism is waning, and leadership needs to come from the South. As we seek our non-permanent seat on the UN Security Council, there has to be a real clarity about what is that opportunity, not just for Kenyans, but for the world.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I want to ascribe to the school of thought that there can be no agreement when one of the major parties is lacking from the dining table. And therefore, it will not stand as long as Palestine remains on the periphery. In saying that, I want to also make clear that the maintenance of international peace and security rests squarely with the UN, and specifically Security Council. And to indicate very clearly, in my 4-year tour of duty in New York with the UN, the issue of Palestine has remained a major agenda on the General Assembly. And every year it is discussed, but always remains a bombshell. Very few want to go into it. It is mentioned, we hear the points, and nothing happens. Maybe it is time now for the UN to come out openly and clearly, take advantage of this, bring the parties on board, and find a possible permanent solution to the current crisis in Jerusalem.
Dr. Mustafa.
Yeah, Dibal, so there's so much hype. Deal of the century is this. It's baffling, actually. It's surprising. And
yeah, it is historic, according to Netanyahu.
Yeah, I mean,
way back to
never,
1948, when now we realize Israel as a state.
Conflict
so
resolution
this one is another.
Conflict resolution 101. You can never have conflict resolution mediation with only one party there and the other one is missing. The second point, very quickly, is that this is you know, latching on to Jared Kushner's plan that he presented in Bahrain, where, you know, that Trump and his nephew is trying to resolve what is essentially a complex political problem with having many layers of conflicts, identity, faith, a colonial legacy, with money and $50 billion. I don't think the Palestinians are going to accept that. It's really abusive. And, you know, great leaders like Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat, who actually consulted and signed the Oslo Accords together, and we could see that that was what was going to work. And when Netanyahu came into the picture, he destroyed everything that had to do with the Oslo Peace Accords. This is revolting, it is appalling.
Last comments?
Ambassador.
You know, I watched that announcement, and the drama there was like those people were told that each time Trump reads a sentence, you stand up and clap. I mean, it's bizarre. That's when you start to see how the world is just being hegemoned, and even Trump's surrogates are completely decimated. But this is a very serious and complex situation, as the panelists have said. It is historical. If you go to the Bible, there has always been a state of Palestine and Israel. So the two-state solution which was offered and accepted internationally is on the table. But what Trump has done, and that's why I have a problem with the UN going to intervene, because immediately the UK accepted it. And you don't forget that UK actually was the one which brought the motion to the UN Security Council in 1948 that created the nation of Israel. And so Boris supporting it immediately. You now have, among the P5, 2 already on one side. So even if you take it there, in fact, Trump has killed multilateralism. So multilateralism will not work. And I think that's why I agree with Dr. Khannenje when he says this is more of a peace, a war plan. In fact, it's not even a plan, it's a vision that even goes beyond what Israel expects. They have given them more land, Judea, Samaria, which Israel has never claimed. But in this plan, it gives them those land. So it is not going, it is dead on arrival, and it is going to create more tension. I must say from the AU has always supported Palestine cause. In fact, at the AU summit, the Palestinian leader is always invited and speaks at the opening session. There is always a decision. It always supports them. And the AU is still going to stand with them. So but the problem is, the Arab world has also been completely destroyed now. When you see Saudi Arabia is on one side, Egypt is in the other side, and others, there is no really broker for this.
Right, thank you. We need to be winding up. Just briefly, last comments. Let's hear from Hassan Khannenje, because now we have Netanyahu, where the United States will recognize Israel's settlement in the West Bank, and in exchange, what I wanted to say, that Israel will agree to accept a 4-year freeze on new settlement activity while Palestinian statehood is being negotiated. Will that be a negotiation if now they've drawn a line in the sand? Briefly, 30 seconds as we're running on.
Everybody has 30 seconds.
Number one, Deval, I think what most people, generally the audiences, don't understand is the way what remained of Palestine is not viable to be a state to start with. That's right. Okay, so whether you freeze or you unfreeze, unless you go back to the basis of the Oslo Accord, where Israel was supposed to go back to the pre-1967 borders, lines, that's where internationally recognized, because the international law recognized that that's annexation and it's illegal. I don't think there's going to be any hope for peace, or rather for a settlement or two-state solution, because there cannot be a two-state solution when the other state does not have the instruments or the territory to actually become a viable.